Welcome to the mysterious casebook. Tonight we follow Miss Marple into the conspiracy at the Silversmith's Guild. A stolen manuscript, a hidden mark in silver, and a secret someone would kill to protect. Where are you listening from late at night or in the daylight hours? Now, light a candle and let the mystery begin. The June sun slanted kindly across the churchyard of St. Mildred's in St. Mary Mead, setting the lichened gravestones aglow and lending a festive air to the otherwise solemn patch of earth. It was the day of the Guild Fair, a yearly affair that drew more than just the village's respectable inhabitants. Outsiders came, too, collectors, antiquarians, and the occasional opportunist who had heard of the Silversmith's Guild's famous display. The Guild, a somewhat grandiose name for what was, in truth, a circle of elderly craftsmen and their descendants, prided itself on a small but impressive collection of silver chalices, candlesticks, and curiosities dating back to the Elizabethan age. This year, the parish hall had been scrubbed, polished, and scented with flowers, for the prized guild collection was to be shown to the public for the first time in nearly a decade. Miss Jane Marple, sitting quietly on a folding chair near the tea table, observed the crowd with mild interest. She had been persuaded to attend by her old friend Mrs. Bantry, who insisted it would be an event of some note. To Miss Marple's eyes it was precisely the sort of gathering that revealed in its very ordinariness the subtle currents of human folly and ambition. Near the display case stood Sir Reginald Mortimer, the Guild's honorary president, whose family had once endowed the parish with silver altar vessels. Tall and still sharp-eyed at 75, he wore his dignity as firmly as he wore his watch chain. At his side fluttered Mrs. Mortimer, fussing endlessly with her gloves and speaking in a shrill voice about the importance of keeping the wrong sort from crowding too close to the display. Elsewhere, the vicar, Reverend Clement, tried valiantly to maintain a spirit of Christian goodwill as the villagers bickered about seating and the order of speeches. His wife, ever practical, directed the teasing girls with military efficiency. Mrs. Bantry, meanwhile, delighted in recounting to anyone who would listen that the Guild's display contained a chalice once rumoured to have been commissioned for Queen Elizabeth herself. But beneath the surface chatter, Miss Marple noticed a few things. A furtive glance exchanged between Mr. Harold Bentz, a solicitor with an uncomfortably red face, and Miss Lydia Carstone, the Guild treasurer. The way young George Linton, an ambitious journalist from London, hovered just a little too eagerly by the case containing the Guild's silver medallions. And perhaps most curious of all, the sharpness in the tone of Mr. Pargeter, the village banker, whenever the subject of accounts or expenses arose. At precisely 3 o'clock, Sir Reginald rapped his cane upon the floor and declared the exhibition officially open. Applause followed, polite and scattered. The crowd surged forward to view the treasures, the chalice, the candlesticks, the finely wrought teaspoons stamped with a silversmith's mark long forgotten by trade but revered by collectors. Then came the moment that silenced the hall. Miss Lydia Carstone, unlocking the largest case with a small brass key, drew back the glass with a triumphant smile only for her expression to crumple in horror. The central space, meant to contain the Guild's most prized possessions, a 17th-century communion plate etched with the Guild's emblem, was empty. A murmur swept through the hall. Mrs. Mortimer gave a shriek. Mr. Bentz swore under his breath. Reverend Clement muttered something about sacrilege, and Sir Reginald Mortimer's cane struck the wooden floor once more, this time not in ceremony, but in fury. "The Guild plate," he thundered. "Gone." The words seemed to hang in the air like the tolling of a funeral bell. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap, lowered her eyes. She did not speak, but in her heart she knew that what had just taken place was no mere theft. For where there is theft among old treasures and respectable villagers, there is nearly always a deeper rot concealed beneath the polish. The theft of the communion plate from the Silversmith's Guild display was the only subject on every tongue in St. Mary Mead that evening. By the time the sun had dipped behind the church tower and the last of the visitors had drifted away from the parish hall, the rumour mill was in full, furious operation. In cottages, drawing rooms, and the snug of the Blue Boar, speculation grew like ivy, twining itself about every villager's suspicions and prejudices. Mrs. Price Ridley, whose capacity for indignation was second only to her skill at embroidery, declared that she had seen a shabbily dressed man loitering by the hedge just before the unveiling. She was certain he was a London thief, drawn by whispers of the guild's treasures. "One can never be too careful with outsiders," she announced, pressing her lips together as if sealing off all further doubt. The fact that no one else had noticed this mysterious vagrant did nothing to diminish her certainty. At the Blue Boar, Mr. Tom Ruddle, the innkeeper, had his own version of events. He swore blind that George Linton, the young journalist, had been hovering about like a magpie, his eyes fixed upon the silver as though he already imagined it glittering under the gaslight of some Fleet Street pawnbroker. Mr. Ruddle's theory carried weight with the beer-drinking regulars, who nodded gravely into their tankards, pleased to have a culprit of suitably metropolitan character. Meanwhile, in the tidy garden of the vicarage, Mrs. Clement entertained Mrs. Bantry and Miss Marple with a dish of sponge cake and a flood of anxieties. "The sacrilege of it," she exclaimed, her hands fluttering in distress, "to take something consecrated, a vessel of holy use, from under the very nose of the parish. It is unthinkable, Jane, and in broad daylight too. Whoever did it must have known precisely when to strike. It all points to someone familiar with the guild, don't you think?" Miss Marple, knitting in her lap, made a small sound of assent without committing herself to agreement. Her needles clicked gently, the pattern growing under her nimble fingers. "One mustn't be too hasty in these matters," she murmured. "Human beings are apt to jump to conclusions rather like a hen clucking at a shadow. I've known many cases where the wrong person was blamed simply because they were convenient to blame." Mrs. Bantry, who relished a mystery as much as her roses, leaned forward eagerly. "But you must admit, Jane, it all seems very odd. I heard that Miss Carston fainted afterwards. Quite overcome, poor woman. And then Harold Bence had to fetch her a glass of brandy. I thought it was rather suspicious, didn't you? People only faint in novels, usually when they have something to hide." Mrs. Clement pursed her lips. "Harold Bence is always too attentive where Lydia Carston is concerned. I have said so for years. If there is trouble in this, you may be sure Harold Bence is not far from it." Rumour and conjecture spread quickly beyond the drawing rooms. By nightfall, several villagers had already resolved in their minds that the guild plate had been stolen by an unscrupulous antique dealer from London, while others insisted it was a local betrayal. Old Mrs. Weatherby, who kept the post office, was quite certain she had seen Mr. Pargeter, the banker, slip into the parish hall before the exhibition began, muttering about accounts. She confided her suspicions in a hushed voice to 2 customers, who immediately repeated them to half a dozen others, with embellishments added. The police arrived from Much Benham in the form of Inspector Graves, a tall, methodical man with a drooping moustache and an air of weary resignation. By the time he had taken down the first dozen statements, his notebook was thick with contradictions. He listened with stolid patience to Mrs. Price Ridley's account of the London tramp, scribbled down Mr. Ruddle's magpie theory about the journalist, and nodded gravely at Mrs. Weatherby's banker suspicion. His only audible comment was a mutter, "Everyone saw something different, it seems." Miss Marple, watching quietly from the edge of the parish hall as Graves questioned the townsfolk, noted the inspector's heavy reliance on material detail doors, locks, keys, and timepieces. She admired his diligence, but also recognized the familiar blindness of officialdom, the assumption that theft was a matter of opportunity alone, uncolored by human vanity or resentment. To Miss Marple, the more interesting evidence was in the expressions that accompanied each accusation, in the subtle relish with which old grievances were polished anew. She reflected that people often revealed more about themselves when pointing the finger at others. Mrs. Price Ridley's story of a tramp seemed motivated by her lifelong fear of strangers. Mr. Ruddle's accusations against George Linton betrayed a publican's irritation with a Londoner who had ordered nothing stronger than ginger beer, and Mrs. Weatherby's suspicions of the banker fit neatly with her dislike of banks in general, owing to a quarrel over penny stamps 20 years prior. When Inspector Graves had finally dismissed the crowd, promising to leave no stone unturned, Miss Marple walked slowly home through the twilight, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side. She had learned little of fact, but much of sentiment, and in human affairs, sentiment often mattered more. Still, she kept her thoughts carefully veiled. To the casual observer, she looked no more than a tired elderly lady ambling towards her cottage for a quiet evening by the fire. In the Mortimer household, meanwhile, tempers flared. Sir Reginald raged about disgrace and demanded tighter scrutiny of guild finances. Mrs. Mortimer wept into her handkerchief and declared that the village had never been safe since the railway line brought all sorts into their midst. Lydia Carstone, pale and shaken, insisted through trembling lips that she had checked the locks twice over that very morning. Harold Bence hovered at her side, alternately protective and defensive, while Mr. Pargeter declared in a voice like ice that the guild's bookkeeping left much to be desired. The quarrel ended only when the butler appeared with a tray of sherry, though the resentments did not dissipate as quickly as the fumes of the decanter. By the week's end, the guild theft had become less an event than an obsession. Every household had a theory, each more elaborate than the last. Some whispered that the plate had been sold to pay a gambling debt. Others muttered that it was an inside job, the work of someone who wanted to expose mismanagement. And a few, the most dramatic, hinted darkly that the theft was but the beginning of something more sinister. Miss Marple, in her neat sitting room, arranged her chrysanthemums in a vase and listened to the church clock strike 8. She thought of the chalice, the candlesticks, the silver teaspoons all left untouched in the case. Only the plate was missing. Why that particular piece? Why in that particular moment when the entire village was gathered? It was a puzzle, and like many puzzles, it was not so much the missing object that intrigued her, but the hands and hearts behind its absence. She folded her hands in her lap and allowed a faint smile to crease her lips. Human nature, she reflected, was like silver itself. Tarnish could spread unseen for years, until suddenly, under the right light, the flaws revealed themselves. Inspector Graves returned to St. Mary Mead the following morning, his moustache drooping a little further after a night of rereading his conflicting statements. The guild theft had become, as he muttered to Sergeant Wilkes, a proper muddle. Yet in the clear light of day, he hoped that sober reflection might yield more than the tangle of gossip that had been thrust upon him the evening before. The parish hall was still locked and under guard, though half the village had wandered past in the last 24 hours, straining for a glimpse through the windows. Graves and Wilkes entered with a jangling of keys and began their examination. The display cases stood undisturbed, the treasures inside gleaming faintly in the pale morning sun. Only the central case, from which the communion plate had vanished, looked altered, the velvet lining faintly creased, a faint smudge upon the glass. Graves crouched to study the lock. No sign of forcing, he muttered. A key was used. He beckoned Wilkes, who scribbled diligently in his notebook. Find out who had access to the keys. Miss Carston, wasn't it? He pursed his lips. Convenient. The sergeant nodded. Shall I bring her in, sir? In good time. Let us tread carefully, Graves replied, straightening his back with a wince. He was aware that accusing the guild treasurer without proof would unleash more outcry than it silenced. Yet the lack of forced entry was telling. Too telling. By mid-morning, the inspector had summoned several guild members to the Mortimer estate, where Sir Reginald insisted the inquiry be conducted. Miss Carston arrived pale and subdued, her hands twisting a damp handkerchief. Harold Bence followed close behind, his florid face tense with indignation. "Lydia has suffered enough," he barked at Graves. "If you think she had a hand in this outrage, you are very much mistaken." Graves held up a calming hand. "No accusations, Mr. Bence, only questions. Who held the keys?" Miss Carston hesitated before answering. "I did, but I gave one to Sir Reginald, for safety. And I believe Mr. Pargeter held another, though he said it was merely precautionary." At this, Sir Reginald rapped his cane sharply against the floor. "Nonsense! I have not touched the lock these 6 months. The key is in my desk, under lock and key itself." Mr. Pargeter gave a thin smile. "The Guild bylaws require 3 holders of the keys. That has long been the custom. But if you mean to suggest that I—" His voice trailed into icy silence. Graves, noting their expressions, jotted in his notebook. 3 keys, all accounted for." His eyes flickered to Miss Carstone, who looked away. "We shall verify." Outside the formal inquiry, the village had already settled into its favorite pastime, speculation. In the butcher's shop, Mrs. Bantry whispered that Harold Bence's eagerness to defend Miss Carston suggested an intimacy more compromising than respectable. At the post office, Mrs. Weatherby repeated her certainty that Mr. Pargeter had been in the hall before the unveiling, though now she added that his shoes had been suspiciously muddy. Each retelling embroidered the details further until even the vicar's wife confessed herself unable to separate truth from invention. Miss Marple, seated in her garden with a basket of mending, heard it all. Neighbors brought her gossip-like offerings at an altar, confident that she, a harmless old lady, would keep their secrets. She listened, nodded, and tucked each piece of information into her mind with the precision of a seamstress folding fabric. She did not chase evidence, but let it drift to her, knowing that truth often surfaced when people spoke too freely. She reflected upon the curious matter of the keys. 3 holders. Yet the plate had vanished without visible disturbance. A simple theft might have targeted smaller, more portable items, such as the teaspoons or the medallions. Why risk the largest and most conspicuous object? Miss Marple thought of human nature, of pride, resentment, and the subtle satisfactions of striking at what others most valued. The choice of the communion plate seemed deliberate, symbolic. That afternoon, Inspector Graves conducted interviews in the vicarage study. George Linton, the journalist, was first to be summoned. He appeared eager, his notebook bristling with jottings, though he protested his innocence with theatrical vigor. "I was there purely to observe, to report on the quaint traditions of your guild. My editor expected nothing more scandalous than a puff piece about candlesticks. Imagine my astonishment when the plate was gone." He leaned forward eagerly. "It is a story, Inspector, but I assure you, not one of my making." Graves eyed him skeptically. "You admit, then, you stood close to the case?" "As close as any member of the crowd, yes. Journalists must have a clear view." The inspector dismissed him with a grunt, though not without noting the young man's restless energy. Wilkes muttered afterward that he wouldn't put it past a Londoner to pocket a relic for profit. Graves did not disagree aloud, though he felt it premature to fasten blame. Next came Mrs. Mortimer, who dissolved into tears almost at once. "The shame of it, Inspector, in my own parish hall, under my very eyes. We are ruined, quite ruined, and poor Reginald, his heart cannot bear such disgrace." Her lamentations yielded little of substance, though Graves noted her insistence that outsiders were at fault. It was the refrain of the fearful, but also of those unwilling to consider betrayal closer to home. Late in the afternoon, Miss Marple herself was invited to share her observations. She entered quietly, her small figure seeming almost lost in the high-backed chair. Graves regarded her with polite condescension. "You were present, madam. Did you observe anything unusual?" Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly as she considered. Only what people showed of themselves, Inspector. It is curious, is it not, how quickly suspicion falls where one wishes it to fall. Poor Miss Carstone faints, and some say it is guilt. Mr. Bence defends her, and others say it is collusion. One learns much from the eagerness of accusation. Graves sighed. I require facts, madam, not reflections. Ah, said Miss Marple mildly, but reflections, like those in polished silver, sometimes show us the truth more plainly than the object itself. She offered no more and was dismissed, yet her words lingered with the inspector longer than he cared to admit. For in his notebook, facts and reflections blurred together until he could scarcely tell which guided his judgment. By evening, as the lamps were lit in cottage windows and the air thickened with the scent of wood smoke, the mystery remained stubbornly unsolved. The communion plate was still missing, the keys accounted for, and the village rife with conjecture. But in the quiet of her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her hearth, eyes fixed upon the dancing flames. She had seen a glance, a hesitation, a too quick protest, not proof, never proof, but the kind of small inconsistency that spoke volumes to one who knew human nature. She picked up her knitting once more, a faint smile upon her lips. The investigation had begun in earnest, though the official inspector sought only material traces. Miss Marple, for her part, pursued a subtler trail of the invisible threads of human weakness, jealousy, and pride that wove the tapestry of crime. The third day after the theft dawned grey and heavy, as though the sky itself sagged under the weight of village suspicion. In the lanes of St. Mary Mead, voices lowered when footsteps passed, curtains twitched, and gossip burrowed deeper into every conversation. It was no longer simply that the communion plate had been stolen. It was the matter of who had dared to do it, and in the minds of many, it was high time the police named a culprit. Inspector Graves, having collated his notes and reflected on the interviews, returned with renewed determination. His mustache bristled as he declared to Sergeant Wilkes, "This will not be solved by chasing every rumor. We must focus on means and opportunity, and the one with both at present is Lydia Carstone." Wilkes nodded, though a shade uneasily. "She had the key, sir, and she fainted right after the plate was shown missing. Doesn't look good." Indeed, Miss Carstone had become the most whispered-about figure in the village. Her fainting fit had provided fertile ground for conjecture. Some said it was the collapse of guilt, others that it was the shock of responsibility. At the guild offices, she continued to keep accounts, her handwriting precise but her manner distracted. Harold Bence hovered protectively, his indignation only fueling whispers that the two were secretly aligned. When Inspector Graves questioned her again, she protested faintly, her voice tremulous. "I swear to you, Inspector, I checked the case myself that morning. The plate was there, gleaming in its place. I locked the case, certain of it. When I opened it again, it was gone. How could that be unless someone had another key?" Graves pressed her, but she could provide no further explanation. Her eyes darted towards Sir Reginald, who stood grim and silent, his cane tapping against the floor. The inspector noted the exchange with satisfaction. To him, her uncertainty only deepened her guilt. Word spread quickly. At the Blue Boar, Mr. Ruddle muttered darkly that Miss Carstone must have sold the plate to pay off Harold Bence's debts, if you ask me. At the post office, Mrs. Weatherby declared she had always thought Miss Carstone a bit too prim by half. Even Mrs. Price Ridley, whose tale of the London tramp had grown increasingly elaborate, conceded that a local betrayal would explain much. Miss Marple listened to it all with her usual serenity. One afternoon she joined Mrs. Bantry in the garden, where the roses glowed red against the pale sky. "It seems settled, Jane," Mrs. Bantry said with satisfaction, snipping a rosebud with her sceptre. "The police are nearly certain it is Miss Carstone. And really it does make sense. She had the key. She fainted. It all fits together, does it not? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Things that fit too neatly, my dear Dolly, are sometimes contrived to do so. I once knew a case where a young woman fainted at her engagement party. It was not guilt, but the corset her aunt insisted she wear. She very nearly died of the tight lacing, but no one suspected the aunt, though she had motives of her own. One must always consider other explanations. Mrs. Bantry laughed. Trust you to think of corsets. But I see what you mean. You think Lydia Carstone is innocent? I think, Miss Marple replied, her eyes thoughtful, that innocence and guilt are not so easily distinguished by fainting fits. One must look at what people do when they believe themselves unseen. It is often more revealing than their grandest protestations. At that moment, Harold Bence himself strode into the garden, his face red with outrage. Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple, forgive me, but I must speak. They are determined to hound Lydia into disgrace. It is monstrous. She has given her life to the guild, kept its books, managed its accounts with precision, and now she is to be accused like a common thief. Mrs. Bantry looked startled by his vehemence, but Miss Marple only regarded him kindly. It must be very distressing for you, Mr. Bence, she said gently. I dare say you feel protective. Protective? I should say so. His fists clenched. I will not allow them to ruin her. If the plate is not found, they will demand her resignation. They may even call for charges. But I tell you, she is not guilty. His passion was genuine, but Miss Marple, who had lived long enough to observe many declarations of devotion, recognized that sincerity could coexist with blindness. She watched him depart, his shoulders rigid, and reflected that men often defended women most fiercely when they themselves stood to lose something. Inspector Graves, however, was not swayed by sentiment. At a meeting in the parish hall, he announced gravely, "We are pursuing strong leads. The evidence suggests that the theft was an inside job. Those who had access to the keys are being carefully examined." The words rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped into a pond. All eyes turned to Lydia Carstone, who stood pale but upright at the back of the hall. A flush crept up her neck, but she did not bow her head. Harold Bence's glare silenced those nearest who dared whisper. It was then that Miss Marple, slipping quietly among the crowd, noticed something curious. As the inspector spoke of keys and guilt, Mr. Pargeter, the banker, standing near the front, tapped his cane lightly against the floor, not in impatience, but in rhythm. A small, unconscious motion, yet his face remained perfectly composed. She wondered, with a spark of interest, whether his thoughts were not on justice, but on calculation. That evening, as the village settled under its blanket of speculation, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting needles flashing in the lamplight. The official inquiry was narrowing itself to the most obvious suspect, as official inquiries so often did. Yet she had learned, in her long years of observation, that human affairs were rarely so simple. There were rivalries in the guild, old quarrels, resentments barely veiled by courtesy. The theft of the plate might be less about silver than about pride, reputation, or revenge. Her needles clicked softly. We must not be too hasty, she murmured to herself. The truth has a way of slipping through the cracks, like a thread unraveling in a well-worn stocking. And when one tugs at the loose end, the whole fabric may come undone. By the fourth day, the village of St. Mary Mead was restless. The theft had ceased to be a shock and had become instead a kind of performance, each resident rehearsing their chosen lines of speculation with increasing embellishment. What had been whispered as suspicion on Monday was loudly proclaimed as certainty by Thursday. Lydia Carstone's name lay at the center of the storm, her fainting fit and possession of a key making her, in the public eye, all but condemned. Inspector Graves encouraged this narrative, though not without reservations. He'd interviewed Lydia twice, and though she answered nervously, her distress struck him as more genuine than fabricated. Still, the evidence of access remained undeniable. The inspector was a man trained to follow what could be seen and touched, not what lay beneath the surface. And so, he built his case upon locks, keys, and fainting fits. Miss Marple, however, had her attention elsewhere. She had walked past the parish hall that morning and paused to admire the roses that climbed along its side wall. As she bent closer, her sharp eyes caught sight of something that others had overlooked. The soil near the window showed a faint impression, half a footprint, smudged, the sole narrow and rather elegant. A woman's shoe, she thought, though not one belonging to Lydia Carstone, whose sturdy boots Miss Marple had often observed when she visited the grocer's. This was something daintier, less suited to village cobbles. She did not linger, nor call attention to it. Instead, she tucked the observation into her mind, as carefully as one folds away a scrap of lace in a drawer, knowing it might be useful later. To Miss Marple, the footprint was less important than the silence surrounding it. No one else had remarked upon it, which meant no one else had thought to look. Later that morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Weatherby at the post office, under the pretense of purchasing stamps. Mrs. Weatherby, pleased to have a listener, leaned forward eagerly. "It will all come out, you'll see, Miss Marple. That Carston girl, she's had her nose in the guild accounts too long, and Harold Bent's forever hanging about her door. Nothing good can come of such attachments." Miss Marple smiled mildly. Yes, attachments can be very dangerous things. One forgets to notice what is happening around one. She accepted her change with a nod. "And what of the banker, Mr. Pargeter? He seems much concerned about the accounts." Mrs. Weatherby pursed her lips. "Pargeter? Oh, he's a cold one, that. But honestly, I suppose, at least no one has caught him out yet." She lowered her voice conspiratorially, though I did see him near the hall that morning. Mud on his shoes, I thought. Very odd, considering it had not rained for days. Miss Marple thanked her, tucking the stamps neatly into her purse. Between the dainty footprint and Mrs. Weatherby's muddy shoes, a pattern began to stir faintly in her mind. She did not press it, however. Such patterns often unravel if pulled too quickly. Meanwhile, Inspector Graves assembled the guild members once again, demanding a full account of their financial dealings. Sir Reginald thundered about honour, Mrs. Mortimer dissolved into more tears, and Mr. Pargeter, calm and glacial, produced ledgers with meticulous entries. Lydia Carstone verified them in a trembling voice, her hands shaking as she turned the pages. The inspector, weary of their quarrels, announced that he would send the ledgers to the county office for examination. This pronouncement silenced the room, though Miss Marple noticed that Pargeter's hand tightened briefly upon his cane. That evening, at Mrs. Bantry's invitation, Miss Marple joined a small gathering in the library at Gossington Hall. Mrs. Bantry was in her element, relaying every scrap of gossip she had gathered during the day. "It is all quite clear, Jane," she declared, pouring sherry into cut-glass tumblers. Lydia took the plate. Harold helped her, and the two of them will sell it to some dreadful dealer in London. Mark my words, we shall soon see it appear in a catalogue. Colonel Bantry, reading the newspaper with half an ear, grunted. "Dash it, Dolly, you can't condemn the girl on gossip alone, though I'll admit it looks bad for her." Miss Marple, sipping her sherry delicately, said nothing. Her mind drifted instead to the footprint and to the curious matter of why only the communion plate had been stolen. Not the candlesticks, not the chalice, not the teaspoons, only the plate. She recalled an old proverb about thieves: some steal for hunger, others for pride. The choice of the plate seemed to speak not of hunger, but of a message. But what message, and to whom? The next morning, Miss Marple ventured once more to the parish hall, ostensibly to speak with Reverend Clement about the church flowers. While waiting for him, she examined the cases again. Her sharp eye caught a detail almost invisible to the casual observer. A faint streak upon the velvet where the plate had lain, not across the center, but near the edge, as though it had been lifted not from within the case, but slid outward. She frowned slightly. If the lock had been opened, why not simply remove it cleanly? Unless haste had been involved or fear of discovery. She was still pondering this when Inspector Graves arrived. "Still curious, Miss Marple," he said, attempting joviality. "Oh, one is always curious about such things," she replied mildly. "They reveal so much of human nature. I was just thinking how odd that the thief did not take the candlesticks. They would fetch a good sum, would they not?" Graves grunted. "Too heavy, perhaps. The plates lighter, easier to conceal." Miss Marple nodded as though satisfied, though in her mind the explanation rang hollow. Heavy objects were often taken when greed was the motive, but when the motive was something else entirely, revenge, humiliation, or to make a point, the choice might fall upon the most symbolic item. And in a guild built upon centuries of pride, what could be more symbolic than the plate that bore their emblem? That evening, as the church bell tolled the hour, Miss Marple sat by her fire and laid down her knitting. She had now 3 small observations: a dainty footprint by the hall, muddy shoes upon a banker, and a curious mark upon the velvet lining. Each in isolation seemed trivial, but together they suggested a story that the inspector's keys and locks theory could not account for. She smiled faintly, the firelight glinting in her eyes. "It is always the little things," she murmured. "People overlook them because they are small, but small things often point to the largest truths." The following days in St. Mary Mead were marked not only by gossip, but by growing tension among the guild members themselves. What had once been a circle of mutual pride in their silver collection had become a battlefield of accusations, each remark weighted with suspicion. The theft had loosened tongues, and long-buried grievances began to seep out like damp through old plaster. Inspector Graves had summoned the principal figures once more to the parish hall for what he termed a consolidation of evidence. It was, in truth, more akin to a public hearing. Villagers crowded the edges of the room under the pretense of assisting or observing, though in reality they hungered for spectacle. Miss Marple, seated discreetly at the back with her knitting, felt the shift in atmosphere. It was no longer about the missing plate alone, it was about the unveiling of characters. Sir Reginald Mortimer stood at the front, his cane rapping sharply against the floor to command attention. "This guild has endured for centuries," he thundered, "and I will not see its honor besmirched by thieves within our very walls. We must root out the culprit, no matter how unpleasant the truth." His wife dabbed her eyes theatrically, murmuring to Mrs. Price Ridley that she feared for her husband's health. Mrs. Price Ridley, whose appetite for drama outweighed her sympathy, nodded gravely while storing away details for later repetition. It was Harold Bence, however, who set the room alight. He rose suddenly, his face flushed. "Enough of this charade. Lydia Carston has served the guild faithfully for years. To suspect her is monstrous. If anyone here bears scrutiny, it should be those who have profited from the guild's finances." His eyes fixed coldly upon Mr. Pargeter. A ripple passed through the room. Mr. Pargeter, calm and deliberate, adjusted his spectacles. "Your insinuations are unfounded, Bence. The accounts are transparent. I've provided them to the inspector himself. Unlike some, I do not rely on dramatics to distract from inconvenient questions." "Transparent?" Bence barked. "Then explain why the guild's reserve funds have dwindled. Where has that money gone? And why, pray, do you guard the ledgers as though they were the crown jewels?" The inspector attempted to intervene, but the spark had already caught. Sir Reginald thundered about propriety, Mrs. Mortimer wailed about scandal, and Miss Carston shrank into her seat, her face pale. Through it all, Mr. Pargeter remained composed, his lips pressed into a thin line, his voice controlled. "The guild's funds are intact. Any loss is due to maintenance and restoration costs. To suggest otherwise is reckless slander. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her gaze lingering on Poirot. His words were calm, but his knuckles were white upon the head of his cane. She had often observed that people revealed themselves not in what they said, but in the small betrayals of their bodies. After the meeting broke in disarray, rumors thickened. Mrs. Weatherby declared to 3 customers that she had known for years the banker was not to be trusted. At the Blue Boar, Mr. Ruddle insisted Bence's fury betrayed desperation, perhaps linked to debts he could not pay. Even Mrs. Clement, usually charitable in her assessments, confessed to Miss Marple that one feels as though the guild is less a society and more a nest of quarrels. That evening, Miss Marple received a quiet visit from Lydia Carstone. The young woman, her face drawn with anxiety, sat in Miss Marple's parlour, clutching her gloves. "I do not know what to do, Miss Marple," she confessed. "The inspector watches me as though I were already guilty. Harold defends me so fiercely that he only makes things worse, and the others look at me with suspicion in their eyes. I swear to you, I did not take the plate." Miss Marple poured her guest a cup of tea, her manner calm and reassuring. "I believe you, my dear. But belief is not enough for the inspector. He seeks evidence. Tell me, was there anything unusual you noticed that day? A glance, a sound, anything out of place?" Lydia hesitated. "There was one thing. When I opened the case and saw the plate was missing, I turned to Sir Reginald. He was white with fury. But for the briefest moment before the others crowded round, I thought I saw something like relief in Mr. Poirot's eyes. Only for a second. And then it was gone." Miss Marple nodded gently. "That is helpful. Relief, you say? That is an odd reaction to a theft. People do not usually feel relieved unless they believe a danger has passed." The words seemed to comfort Lydia, though only slightly. When she departed, Miss Marple reflected on what she had heard. A dainty footprint by the hall, muddy shoes on a banker, a curious mark on the velvet. And now a fleeting expression of relief. Each was small, but each carried weight. She smiled faintly, thinking of her garden. Weeds, too, began as small things. Left unchecked, they revealed the neglect of the soil. The following afternoon brought another revelation. Mrs. Bantry, always eager to deliver tidings, arrived breathless at Miss Marple's cottage. "Jane, you'll never believe it. George Linton, the journalist, was seen speaking with a stranger by the railway station last night. A man with a valise, very shabby looking. They say money changed hands." Miss Marple listened without interruption, her face composed. Did anyone see what was exchanged? Mrs. Bantry admitted not, but she was certain it was significant. He is a sly one, that of Linton. Mark my words, he is involved. After Mrs. Bantry left, Miss Marple sat quietly in her chair, her mind working. Gossip was like a tangled skein, some threads worthless, others essential. One must learn which to discard. She doubted that George Linton had masterminded the theft. His energy was too restless, too obvious. Yet his eagerness for a story might make him an accessory, or at least a witness to something he did not fully understand. By week's end, the guild had fractured. Meetings dissolved into quarrels, friendships soured, and the theft of the plate became less a singular crime than a mirror reflecting every hidden resentment. Inspector Graves grew impatient, his investigation mired in contradictions. "One of them did it," he told Sergeant Wilkes grimly. "It's just a matter of which snake is in the basket." Miss Marple, seated by her window as dusk settled over the village, thought differently. "It is not just a matter of who took the plate," she murmured to herself. "It is a matter of why, and when one sees the why clearly, the who will follow as naturally as night follows day." The village awoke on Saturday morning to news that spread faster than the ring of the church bell. Another incident had occurred. This time, it was not a theft, but an attack, though of what kind and upon whom depended on which villager one asked. By the time Miss Marple stepped out of her cottage to fetch the morning paper, 3 different versions of the story had already reached her ears. The facts, once untangled, were that Harold Bence, the solicitor and Lydia Carston's most ardent defender, had been discovered unconscious in his office shortly after dawn. His clerk, arriving early, had found him slumped across his desk, the ink from an overturned inkwell staining his sleeve. The window had been left ajar, the lock unfastened. On the floor near his chair lay a silver teaspoon, the very kind displayed in the Guild's case, though it was not clear whether it had been stolen or planted. Inspector Graves, summoned at once, declared the matter an alarming development. He paced Bence's office while Sergeant Wilkes examined the teaspoon with gloved hands. "First the plate, now this," Graves muttered. "The rogue grows bold or desperate. Was it a burglary gone wrong or an attempt to silence Bence? And what of this spoon? Is it proof of guilt or merely a trick?" Bence himself, roused with smelling salts, could provide little clarity. He groaned, clutched his head, and declared he had been struck from behind. "I heard a noise by the window," he mumbled, and then nothing. His manner was dazed, though Graves noted with suspicion that no serious injury was visible. The blow, if there had been one, was not severe. Still, the incident ignited a fresh blaze of speculation across the village. By mid-morning, the Blue Boar was crowded with voices. Mr. Ruddle declared it an inside quarrel. Mrs. Price Ridley insisted that Bence had staged the attack himself to divert suspicion from Lydia Carstone. Mrs. Weatherby, ever dramatic, hinted at a conspiracy of silence within the Guild, declaring, "Mark my words, the spoon is a sign. Whoever left it meant we had to think something. What precisely was meant, she could not say." Miss Marple, listening to these theories as she sipped her tea at Mrs. Bantry's, felt the pieces of the puzzle shift again. The placement of the spoon intrigued her. A thief careless enough to drop such an object would surely have taken it with them, or was it left deliberately, a breadcrumb to lead the investigation astray? She thought of her earlier observation that the theft of the plate was not about value alone, but symbolism. Could the spoon be another message, a clue meant to mislead or to taunt? Mrs. Bantry, meanwhile, relished the drama. "An assault, Jane. Imagine. It's almost too thrilling, but I cannot decide was Harold Bence the target because he knows too much, or because he is guilty and someone wants him silenced?" Miss Marple set down her cup. "There is another possibility, Dolly, that he was not the target at all, but the stage. An incident to sway suspicion one way or another. People do very curious things when they feel cornered." At the vicarage, Reverend Clement fretted over the matter with his wife. "Violence, Griselda, in our very parish. What must the bishop think?" Mrs. Clement, though distressed, was sharper. "It is curious, is it not, that the Guild's quarrels have become so public? One might almost believe the theft was never about silver at all, but about exposing the Guild's secrets." Inspector Graves, for his part, grew more convinced that Lydia Carstone and Harold Bence were entwined in the affair. The girl had the key, the solicitor the motive, he told Wilkes. If the plate was taken to cover financial irregularities, the spoon may have been planted to draw us off. Or perhaps Bence dropped it in his confusion. Either way, their connection is too close to ignore. Wilkes, more cautious, asked, "And what of Pargeter, sir, or the Mortimers?" Mightn't they? But Graves waved him off. "We cannot chase every shadow, Sergeant. Focus on the pair with the clearest opportunity." News of the assault brought Lydia Carstone to Miss Marple's door once more. She looked pale, her eyes reed-rimmed. "They think Harold staged it," she whispered. "But I know he didn't. He would never strike himself. He was frightened, Jane truly frightened. What if the thief tried to silence him because he had discovered something?" Miss Marple took her hand gently. "And had he discovered something? I do not know. He spoke to me 2 nights ago, saying the guild's accounts hid a discrepancy. But he would not explain further, only that he must look into it. I begged him to be careful. Now this, her voice trembled. Miss Marple soothed her with tea and kind words, though her mind was alert. A discrepancy in the accounts. Relief on Mr. Pargeter's face, a dainty footprint by the hall, each thread seemed to tug at the same knot, though the pattern was not yet clear. But she had learned, in long years of observation, that truth often emerged in the smallest inconsistencies. That evening, the villagers gathered once more in the parish hall for a meeting, though this time less to debate and more to reassure themselves that order remained. Sir Reginald, still thundering about honour, demanded that the guild root out traitors in its midst. Mrs. Mortimer wailed about safety. Mr. Pargeter spoke with calm precision about the need for careful stewardship and dismissed Bence's attack as a melodrama distracting from serious inquiry. It was then that George Linton, the journalist, seized his chance. He rose, notebook in hand, and declared boldly, "The public has a right to know the truth. If the guild's treasures are vanishing and its members quarrelling, then surely this is not merely theft, but scandal. I intend to write as much for my paper." Gasps filled the hall. Sir Reginald thundered that he would not permit slander. Mrs. Mortimer fainted theatrically, and Lydia, trembling, looked ready to collapse under the renewed suspicion. Harold Bence, still weak but defiant, shouted that the guild had much to answer for. The meeting dissolved in chaos, voices rising, accusations hurled. From her quiet corner, Miss Marple watched with keen eyes. She saw the flicker of satisfaction on George Linton's face, yet also the flicker of alarm on Mr. Pargeter's. She saw Lydia's terror, Harold's fury, Sir Reginald's indignation, and in all of it she sensed the shape of something larger than theft alone. There was a pattern here. A theft, a planted clue, an assault, steps in a dance not yet finished. As she walked home through the cool night, the stars faintly visible through drifting clouds, Miss Marple reflected on the curious nature of conspiracies. They were rarely tidy. They spilled, they tangled, they contradicted themselves, and yet, if one watched carefully, one might see the threads that bound them. She murmured to herself, the spoon was meant to speak. The question is, to whom? The Sunday following Harold Bence's assault was a day of peculiar stillness in St. Mary Mead. The church bells rang out as usual, yet the congregation arrived in smaller numbers, their faces taut with anxiety. Some avoided sitting near Lydia Carstone, whose presence drew sidelong glances. Others whispered that Harold Bence, though recovering, had failed to attend, a sign of either weakness or guilt, depending on whom one asked. Miss Marple attended service as she always did, neat and composed in her Sunday best, her mind attuned less to the sermon than to the faces around her. Human nature revealed itself most in the pews. The clasp of a hand, the stiffness of a back, the eagerness with which one turned to greet or avoided greeting a neighbor. She noted how Mrs. Mortimer clutched her prayer book tightly, her lips pressed thin in disapproval. Sir Reginald stood with his chin high, his hymn singing booming as if to drown out any whisper of scandal. Mr. Pargeter's voice, by contrast, was steady and controlled, his gaze fixed forward, yet his hand tapped once again upon his cane during a pause. Lydia's voice was faint, trembling on the hymns, while George Linton, the journalist, mouthed words absent-mindedly, his eyes darting toward the congregation more than the altar. After the service, knots of villagers gathered in the churchyard, their conversations brisk and pointed. Inspector Graves, making a rare Sunday appearance, exchanged curt words with Sir Reginald, who demanded swift action. "The honour of the guild is at stake," he declared, loud enough for half the congregation to hear. "If you cannot produce the thief, Inspector, we shall be ruined." Graves muttered reassurances, though privately he despaired. The theft, the assault, the planted spoon each added complexity without clarity. He told Sergeant Wilkes later, "It is as though someone wishes to throw dust in our eyes, Sergeant. Every step we take, another twist appears." Miss Marple, overhearing as she passed, smiled faintly. "Yes, dust can be very useful. It obscures the footprints one does not wish to be followed." She did not elaborate, but Graves frowned, half suspecting that the elderly lady saw further than he did. He had no time for riddles, however, and returned to Much Benham with his notes, leaving the villagers to their own speculations. That afternoon, Miss Marple invited Mrs. Bantry for tea. Over currant buns and a pot of Darjeeling, she gently steered the conversation toward Harold Bent's. "Do you think, Dolly, that his attack was genuine? Or perhaps staged, as some suggest?" Mrs. Bantry, always eager to entertain theories, leaned forward. "It is difficult to say. He does care for Lydia, that much is plain. And if he staged it, surely she would know, unless he wished to protect her by drawing suspicion upon himself. Romantic, don't you think?" "Romantic, perhaps," Miss Marple said softly, "but not necessarily wise. Men sometimes do foolish things under the guise of protecting women. It has been so since time immemorial. Yet I wonder whether Harold's attack was less about romance and more about distraction." "Distraction?" Mrs. Bantry raised her brows. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, her needles clicking softly, a very effective way of turning eyes away from something else. One must always ask what was happening elsewhere while the village was fixated upon Harold. This question lingered in Mrs. Bantry's mind long after she left. For Miss Marple, it was another thread to weave into the growing tapestry. The following day brought fresh fuel to the fire. George Linton's article appeared in the London paper, carrying a sensational headline, "Village Guild in Scandal. Treasures vanish, members at war." Copies found their way into St. Mary Mead by afternoon post, and soon half the village was abuzz with indignation. Sir Reginald declared it libel, Mrs. Mortimer threatened legal action, and Mr. Pargeter, visibly displeased, remarked icily that sensational journalism has undone more reputations than actual guilt. Lydia Carstone, on reading the article, burst into tears. Harold, still recovering, swore to sue. But Miss Marple observed George Linton himself, who, far from triumphant, looked rather uneasy under the storm he had stirred. "Curious," she murmured to herself, "a man eager for a story, but not for the consequences of it." It was then that a small incident caught her attention. While walking past the guild office that afternoon, she noticed a delivery boy struggling with a parcel. The label bore the Mortimer address, yet the boy muttered that it had first been sent from London. Miss Marple, with gentle kindness, offered to help carry it the last few steps. She observed, as the butler signed for it, that the package was unusually heavy. Later, when word spread that it contained silver polish and cleaning materials, she raised her brows. Odd, she thought. One does not usually require so much polish unless one expects tarnish or unless one wishes to explain the sudden shining of something not meant to be polished. That evening, she reflected upon her notes. The plate had been stolen with deliberation, the spoon planted to confuse, Harold Bent struck down, or perhaps merely staged while financial discrepancies lurked in the background. And now, a curious parcel of silver polish. The threads were tightening, and though she could not yet name the hand that wove them, she felt certain the fabric was nearly complete. Meanwhile, tensions in the village escalated. At the Blue Boar, a heated confrontation broke out between Harold Bent and George Linton. "You've ruined her," Bent shouted, his fist slamming the table. "Your cursed article has made Lydia a pariah." Linton, pale but defiant, retorted, "The truth must out, sir. If the guild hides secrets, it is not my fault that daylight exposes them." The quarrel ended with Bent storming out, leaving the villagers to murmur about tempers and guilt. Mrs. Price Ridley declared the solicitor a dangerous man, while Mr. Ruddle insisted the journalist was the true villain. And so the circle of suspicion widened again, engulfing nearly everyone connected with the guild. That night, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting abandoned on her lap. She thought of the footprint by the hall, the muddy shoes of the banker, the mark on the velvet, the relief in Pargeter's eyes, the silver polish delivered to the Mortimers. Each detail was a thread, small and seemingly trivial, yet together they formed a pattern. Not yet complete, but discernible enough to make her smile faintly. People, she murmured, are so often careless in their attempts to deceive. They forget that even the smallest thread, once tugged, can unravel the entire tapestry. And I dare say it will not be long before this one comes undone. The week wore on, and the village seemed to grow more restless with every passing day. Though the police investigation continued, no progress had been made. The communion plate remained missing, the silver teaspoon planted at Harold Bentz's office unresolved, and the villagers' patience stretched thin. Inspector Graves, weary from endless interviews, confessed to Sergeant Wilkes that the affair was more tangled than a basket of fishing lines. Miss Marple, however, did not appear discouraged. On the contrary, she seemed more composed than ever, her needles clicking softly as she sat in the corner of gatherings, her eyes thoughtful. She had watched the storm of suspicion swirl around Lydia Carston, shift toward Harold Bentz, then hover uneasily over George Linton and Mr. Pargeter. Each suspect carried motives, opportunities, or both. Yet none had been caught in any decisive falsehood. And so she resolved to apply what she always found most effective, a little test of human nature. It was after Sunday tea at the Bantrys' that she suggested to Mrs. Bantry that they host a small gathering. "Only a dozen or so," Miss Marple said mildly. "Perhaps under the guise of restoring goodwill in the guild. A few sandwiches, a pot of tea. Nothing formal." Mrs. Bantry, delighted at any excuse for hospitality, agreed at once. Invitations were quietly extended, and by Tuesday afternoon the drawing room of Gossington Hall was filled with the uneasy company of suspects. Sir Reginald and Lady Mortimer arrived first, the former stiff with dignity, the latter fluttering with anxiety. Mr. Pargeter followed, precise and immaculate as ever, though his eyes betrayed irritation at being summoned. Lydia Carston came hesitantly, Harold Bentz at her side, his manner protective and defiant. George Linton entered last, notebook conspicuously absent, though his restless gaze missed nothing. Inspector Graves, invited by Colonel Bantry for form's sake, sat in a corner, his moustache bristling at the prospect of village theatrics. Miss Marple, quietly knitting near the window, gave the appearance of an elderly lady enjoying a pleasant afternoon. Yet her mind was alert. She had arranged matters carefully, intending to observe not what was said, but how. People betrayed themselves under the smallest pressures, and she intended to provide precisely the right sort. After tea was poured and small talk stumbled along, Miss Marple set her plan in motion. She leaned toward Mrs. Bantry, remarked in a voice just loud enough to carry, "It is extraordinary how quickly silver tarnishes when handled improperly. Why, only last week I heard of a piece recovered after a theft that shone far too brightly because the thief had polished it before attempting to sell. The effect was immediate. Sir Reginald harumphed, Lady Mortimer gasped, Lydia Carston paled, Harold Bentz frowned, George Linton raised his brows with curiosity. But it was Mr. Pargeter whose hand gripped his cane a fraction too tightly, his knuckles whitening as he forced a thin smile. Miss Marple noted the reaction, though she said nothing further. The conversation turned, as it always did, to the theft itself. Harold Bentz defended Lydia passionately, his voice rising in indignation. George Linton countered with questions about guild finances, hinting that the truth lay buried in the ledgers. Sir Reginald thundered about honor. Lady Mortimer wept. The quarrel gathered heat until Colonel Bantry interjected, urging calm. All the while, Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her eyes flicking from one speaker to the next. It was then that she dropped her second thread. "Of course," she said mildly, "the strangest thing about the theft is not that the plate was taken, but that only the plate was taken. A thief driven by greed might have snatched smaller, more portable objects, but the planet was the Guild's emblem, was it not? A very pointed choice." There was silence. Into it, George Linton blurted, "Exactly." It was a message, a strike at the heart of the Guild's pride. His enthusiasm seemed genuine, though a touch too eager. By contrast, Mr. Pargeter's lips tightened further, while Harold Bentz glanced protectively at Lydia. Sir Reginald bristled with outrage. Miss Marple allowed the silence to stretch, then calmly resumed her knitting. Inspector Graves, watching, was irritated. "All very clever, madam," he muttered to her later. "But we need proof, not parlor games." Miss Marple only smiled. But games often reveal more than questions, Inspector. People forget themselves when they believe they are safe." The following morning she staged her third and most decisive test. She visited the parish hall, accompanied by Mrs. Bantry and Lydia Carstone, under the pretext of examining flowers for an upcoming fête. With deliberate care, she remarked as they stood before the empty case, "I heard, quite by accident, that the missing plate had been recovered. It was found in a most unlikely place, wrapped in brown paper and hidden among the church linens." Lydia gasped in astonishment. Mrs. Bantry exclaimed with delight, but Miss Marple's eyes were not on them. She watched the doorway, where Harold Bentz and Mr. Pargeter had just entered. Bentz blinked, his jaw dropping before he laughed nervously and demanded, "Where is it? We must see it at once." His tone was unsteady, but eager. Pargeter, however, froze. His face drained of color, his hand jerked slightly upon his cane, and for one unguarded moment, relief flickered across his features before he quickly masked it with disdain. Miss Marple filed the reaction carefully away. The lie about the plate's recovery had served its purpose. Those who were innocent showed surprise, even joy. Only the guilty showed something else, fear or relief that the search had ended. That evening, she sat quietly by her fire, her knitting laid aside. The tapestry of clues was nearly complete now: the footprint by the hall, the muddy shoes, the mark on the velvet, the parcel of polish, the flicker of relief, and now the unguarded reaction to her deception. It pointed toward one direction, one hand, one mind behind the theft. Yet still she hesitated. Human nature was rarely simple, and she wished to be certain before she spoke. At Gorsington Hall the next day, Mrs. Bantry pressed her. "Jane, you must tell the inspector what you've seen. He flounders about like a fish in a net, and the village is half out of its wits." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Soon, my dear, but not quite yet. One must allow the guilty just enough rope to reveal themselves. It is never wise to snatch at a thread too soon. Better to let it unravel in its own time." As she spoke, her eyes twinkled with quiet certainty. The moment was coming. The truth would soon stand revealed, and when it did, it would be not through force of law, but through the simple, inexorable weight of human nature exposing itself. The tension in St. Mary Mead had reached a fever pitch by the time the next guild meeting was called. The theft of the communion plate had unsettled the village, but the assault upon Harold Bentz, the planted teaspoon, and now whispers of financial irregularities had frayed every bond of trust. Even the parish's most stoic souls seemed uneasy, as though each shadow might conceal treachery. Sir Reginald Mortimer insisted that the meeting be held at his house, to restore dignity to the guild. The Mortimer estate, with its high ceilings and stern portraits, provided a fitting stage for the drama. Yet dignity was hard to maintain when half the participants refused to look the other half in the eye. Lydia Carston sat pale and silent beside Harold Bentz, who still bore a faint bruise upon his temple. Mr. Pargeter, immaculate as ever, stood stiffly near the hearth, his cane tapping faintly on the floor. George Linton arrived late, notebook in hand once more, his restless gaze flitting about the room. Mrs. Mortimer, dabbing her eyes with lace handkerchiefs, muttered about shame and disgrace, while Sir Reginald thundered about guild honour. Inspector Graves, seated heavily at a table, wore the expression of a man who would rather have been anywhere else. His notebook lay open, but his eyes betrayed exhaustion. Sergeant Wilkes hovered in the background, sharp-eyed, while Miss Marple sat unobtrusively in a corner, her knitting basket resting upon her lap. To all appearances, she was present merely as a courtesy guest. Yet her eyes missed nothing. The meeting began with Sir Reginald's customary speech about tradition, honour, and betrayal. He demanded answers, pounding his cane upon the floor for emphasis. Mr. Pargeter then presented the guild's accounts, his voice calm, his figures precise. Yet Harold Bence interrupted, his anger barely contained. "Figures can be manipulated, Pargeter. You present numbers, but what is the truth behind them? There are discrepancies, entries that do not match. If the communion plate is missing, I say it is tied to those very accounts." The room erupted. Mrs. Mortimer gasped. George Linton scribbled furiously in his notebook. Inspector Graves muttered for order. Lydia Carston buried her face in her hands. Through the din, Mr. Pargeter remained unruffled, merely adjusting his spectacles. "Baseless allegations," he said coolly. "The accounts have been examined and will withstand scrutiny." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. She thought of Lydia's earlier words, of the fleeting relief she had seen on Pargeter's face, of the parcel of polish delivered to the Mortimer house. The pieces continued to align, yet she waited. Human nature revealed itself best under pressure, and the pressure in the room was mounting. George Linton, seizing the moment, spoke loudly. "The public has a right to know, and I intend to ensure it does. If the guild conceals financial mismanagement, if treasures are vanishing, then my paper will expose it. The world will know that St. Mary Mead is no longer the sleepy village it pretends to be." Sir Reginald roared with indignation. Mrs. Mortimer shrieked. Inspector Graves glowered. And through it all, Mr. Pargeter's lips tightened, his composure held but only just. Miss Marple noted how his hand trembled faintly upon the cane, how his eyes flicked once, briefly, to the sideboard where the Mortimer's silver gleamed. A man conscious of silver, always conscious of silver. The quarrel escalated until Inspector Graves, exasperated, raised his voice. "Enough. We will not settle this by shouting. The police will pursue the matter of the theft. Until then, I caution all of you to remain calm. Any further incidents will be dealt with severely." The meeting adjourned in confusion, villagers leaving in clusters, muttering darkly. Yet even as they departed, the air seemed heavy with unfinished business, as though the guild itself groaned under the weight of concealed truth. Later that evening, Miss Marple walked home beneath the quiet of the twilight sky. Her mind turned over the day's events, each detail fitting more firmly into place. She had seen enough now to know where the truth lay. Yet she did not rush to speak it. Timing mattered. The guilty must be given the opportunity to reveal themselves fully, lest doubt linger. At her cottage, she arranged her chrysanthemums in a vase and sat by the fire with her knitting. She thought again of the plate, why only it had been taken, why the spoon had been left, why Harold Bence had been struck. The answer, she knew, lay not in greed but in pride, in concealment, and in fear of exposure. She recalled her own little test, the false news of the plate's recovery. The reactions had told her all she needed, but still, she must wait for the right moment to gather them together, to lay the pattern bare. The next morning brought fresh agitation. Word spread that a letter had arrived at the vicarage, unsigned but written in a neat hand. It declared that the truth lies in the guild itself, and that the thief hides among those most trusted. The note, shown discreetly to Inspector Graves, offered no proof, only menace. Yet its effect was profound. The villagers whispered of conspiracies, of anonymous threats, of hidden enemies. Some said it was the thief mocking them, others that it was an innocent villager leading the investigation forward. Miss Marple, shown the letter by Mrs. Clement, read it with interest. "Anonymous notes are very revealing," she murmured. "Not so much in what they say, but in the choice of words. A person reveals themselves, even in secrecy." She folded the letter gently and returned it. "But I should not worry too much. It is often a sign that someone grows desperate." That evening, the Bantrys hosted another informal gathering, this time with a more subdued air. The villagers, weary of open quarrels, spoke in quieter tones, though suspicion still lurked in every glance. Miss Marple, seated once more with her knitting, watched carefully. She noted how Lydia Carstone avoided Mr. Pargeter's eyes, how Harold hovered protectively, how George Linton scribbled furtively, how Sir Reginald thundered less than usual, as though burdened by doubt. And she thought to herself, the moment is nearly here. Another twist may yet come, but the threads are already knotted. Soon they will not be able to hide from themselves. Her needles clicked. Outside, the night deepened. Inside, the village's secrets pressed closer to breaking point. The stage was set, though none of them yet knew it, for the quiet old lady with the knitting would soon draw the curtain aside. And when she did, the truth would shine out as plainly as polished silver. On Tuesday evening, the air in St. Mary Mead carried the crisp chill of early autumn, though the calendar still insisted upon summer. A thin mist rose over the fields, curling around the hedgerows, as if the village itself were holding its breath. Inside the parish hall, a gathering had been called at Miss Marple's quiet suggestion to Mrs. Bantry, who passed it to Sir Reginald, who insisted upon it in tones that brooked no refusal. Thus it was that the chief figures of the guild, the inspector, and a few key villagers assembled under the high wooden beams, the gas lamps hissing faintly. The arrangement was simple. A table at the front for Sir Reginald, Lady Mortimer, Mr. Pargeter, Lydia Carstone, Harold Bentz, and George Linton. Inspector Graves and Sergeant Wilkes took their places to one side, notebooks at the ready. Mrs. Bantry, eager for the drama, had insisted she and Colonel Bantry attend, and Miss Marple, of course, sat quietly in her customary corner, her knitting in her lap. To outward eyes, she was merely an observer, but in truth, the gathering had been contrived precisely for her purpose. Sir Reginald opened the proceedings with his usual thunder. "We are disgraced, ruined. Unless the thief is unmasked tonight, the guild's name is finished. I will not see centuries of honor destroyed by silence." He pounded his cane for emphasis, his wife dabbing her eyes beside him. Inspector Graves cleared his throat. "We are pursuing every line of inquiry. Sir Reginald. But as yet, no decisive evidence." He broke off as Miss Marple rose slowly from her seat, leaning lightly on her stick. A hush spread through the hall. It was unusual for the old lady to interject, and those who knew her well sensed something momentous in the air. She smiled gently, her eyes twinkling. "Perhaps, Inspector, if you will forgive me, a few small observations may be of use. Sometimes the tiniest details tell us more than the grandest evidence." Graves, weary and exasperated, gestured with a sigh. "By all means, madam. We have heard every theory from every villager, so why not yours as well?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "Thank you. It is a curious matter, is it not, that of all the treasures displayed, only the communion plate was taken. Not the chalice, not the candlesticks, not the teaspoons. The plate alone. That tells us the theft was not for money, but for something more particular symbolism. And who in this guild has the most to lose if its emblem, its pride, its very symbol of integrity were destroyed? or hidden? Murmurs stirred among the audience. Her needles clicked once before she set them down. Then, consider the footprints. A faint impression outside the hall, dainty, a woman's shoe. Not Lydia's sturdy boots, which I have observed often, but something altogether more elegant. And yet, more telling still, were the muddy shoes worn by Mr. Pargeter on a day when the ground was dry. An odd inconsistency, would you not agree? Mr. Pargeter shifted, his face controlled. I walk the fields often. Mud is hardly incriminating. Quite so, Miss Marple said gently. Mud is not incriminating. But the absence of mud when one ought to have it can be very revealing. Just as the presence of polish is curious. A parcel delivered to the Mortimer household contained silver polish, an unusually large quantity. Why, unless some object required urgent cleaning? And yet the Guild's silver was not in need of it, unless, of course, it was newly handled by hands that wished to erase their mark. Mrs. Mortimer gasped. Lydia Carston whispered Harold's name, but Miss Marple pressed on, her voice calm and certain. And then there is the matter of human reaction. When I spread the false report that the plate had been found, every innocent soul expressed surprise or relief. Only one showed something different, a flicker of fear, of calculation suddenly altered. That was you, Mr. Pargeter. The banker's hand tightened on his cane, his lips compressing into a thin line. Sir Reginald's cane struck the floor. "Pargeter, you dare!" But Miss Marple raised her hand for quiet. "Do not mistake me, Sir Reginald." Mr. Pargeter did not steal out of greed. His motive was pride and concealment. Harold Bence was correct to suspect discrepancies in the Guild's accounts. Funds were missing, diverted quietly. The communion plate, symbol of the Guild's honor, was taken to shift suspicion elsewhere, to create turmoil, to bury the scent of financial mismanagement. And when suspicion threatened to fall on Lydia Carstone, the teaspoon was planted at Harold's office, an attempt to widen the net of confusion. Inspector Graves leaned forward, eyes narrowing. And the assault upon Bence? "A staged distraction," Miss Marple replied, her voice steady. "Not staged by Harold himself, though some believed it so, but contrived by another hand. A light blow, enough to alarm, to silence questions, and who better than a man accustomed to calculation, to risk, to concealment? A banker whose ledgers, once examined closely, would reveal the truth. All eyes turned to Pargeter. He remained still, his expression carefully composed. At last he spoke, his voice calm but cold. "You weave a clever story, Miss Marple. Yet where is your proof? A footprint, a parcel of polish, a reaction to a falsehood. These are trifles." Miss Marple's smile deepened. "Yes, trifles. But trifles, Mr. Pargeter, make up life. I have seen many cases where trifles betrayed the guilty. The communion plate was not taken by a London thief, nor by poor Lydia. It was hidden by you, Mr. Pargeter, to protect your reputation and to divert eyes from your accounts. And when you are pressed, as you shall be, the missing plate will be found polished to a shine, hidden among items you thought unexamined." A silence fell, heavy and complete. Sir Reginald's face purpled with fury, Lady Mortimer fainted into Mrs. Bantry's arms, and George Linton scribbled frantically in his notebook. Harold Bence gave a triumphant shout, while Lydia looked near to collapse. Inspector Graves rose slowly, his moustache bristling. "Mr. Pargeter," he said, "you will come with us." For the first time, the banker faltered. His shoulders slumped, his composure cracked. "You do not understand," he said quietly. "The Guild is corrupt, funds mismanaged for years. I sought to expose it, to protect what remained. The plate was never meant for sale. It was meant to be hidden, to shame them into truth." Miss Marple regarded him gently. "Perhaps so. But one cannot right a wrong with another wrong, Mr. Pargeter. The guild may have its flaws, but theft and deception serve no good end. It is always human pride that undoes us in the end. The inspector signalled to Sergeant Wilkes, who stepped forward. Poirot did not resist. The villagers murmured in shock as the banker was led away. In the corner, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly, her face serene. The matter was nearly settled, though the final threads of the aftermath remained to be woven. In the days that followed Mr. Poirot's arrest, the village of St. Mary Mead settled into a hush that was less peaceful than exhaustion. Gossip, which had once flown thick and fast, now crept more cautiously. People were ashamed of how loudly they had accused Lydia Carstone, or how eagerly they had speculated about Harold Bence, or how willingly they had swallowed George Linton's tales of conspiracy. Yet shame never kept tongue still for long. The story of the stolen communion plate and the downfall of the banker would be repeated for years, each retelling shaded by the speaker's own biases and alibis. Inspector Graves, his mustache more drooping than ever, oversaw the search of Poirot's properties. As Miss Marple had predicted, the missing plate was discovered, carefully wrapped in linen and polished to a gleam, hidden in the recess of an old chest in his cellar. Alongside it lay records of his accounts, entries carefully altered, figures manipulated, funds diverted to cover speculative ventures that had failed. He had not enriched himself so much as tried desperately to cover his own missteps. His pride, as Miss Marple later explained, would not allow him to admit incompetence. Better, he had thought, to stage a theft, to cast suspicion outward, to muddy the waters until no one looked too closely at the books. When the news spread, Sir Reginald Mortimer declared it a vindication of the guild's honour. "One rotten apple does not spoil the barrel," he proclaimed. "The guild remains a pillar of tradition." His words were repeated widely, though whispered in corners was the acknowledgment that his thunderous speeches had not shielded them from scandal. Lady Mortimer, true to form, wept at every mention of betrayal, and made certain all who visited knew of her distress. Lydia Carstone, though cleared of suspicion, carried the scars of the ordeal. For weeks she walked the village with her head bowed, as though waiting for whispers that no longer came. Harold Bence remained steadfast at her side, his indignation mellowed into protectiveness. "You see, Lydia," he told her one evening, "the truth will out. You must hold your head high again." Whether their bond would blossom into something more, no one yet knew, but Miss Marple, with her gentle eye, suspected that time would settle the matter in favour of affection. George Linton, the journalist, found himself both triumphant and uneasy. His paper had seized upon the scandal with relish, but the villagers viewed him now with wary eyes. They resented the intrusion of his words, the way he had magnified their shame for London readers. He returned to the city soon after, notebook full, though perhaps a touch more thoughtful about the weight of his ink. Inspector Graves departed St. Mary Mead with relief, declaring to Sergeant Wilkes that villages breed more mischief than cities. Yet he admitted, grudgingly, that Miss Marple's observations had proven more effective than all his formal methods. "She sees things," he muttered, "that aren't in any manual." Wilkes, wiser than his superior, remarked softly, "She sees people, sir, and Miss Marple herself." She returned quietly to her cottage, her garden, her knitting. She accepted thanks from Lydia and Harold with modest nods, brushed aside Mrs. Bantry's effusive praise, and deflected Inspector Graves' reluctant acknowledgment with her usual humility. To those who pressed her, she merely said, "It was nothing really. One notices things, that is all." But in the solitude of her sitting room, she reflected with her familiar mixture of satisfaction and melancholy. Human nature, she mused, was at once predictable and endlessly surprising. Pride, that old sin, had undone Mr. Poirot not greed, not envy, but the refusal to be seen as fallible. How many times had she seen such pride drive men and women alike into folly? Too many to count. She thought, too, of Lydia Carstone, unfairly accused, and of Harold's blind devotion, of Sir Reginald's thunder, masking fear of scandal, of Lady Mortimer's tears, sincere perhaps, yet always displayed, of George Linton's restless ambition, feeding on others' misfortune. Each had revealed themselves under the pressure of crime, just as silver revealed its flaws when polished. The plate had not been the only thing uncovered. The entire village had been forced to confront its blemishes. That evening, as the church bell tolled 8, Miss Marple sat by her fire with her knitting in hand. Outside, the village returned to its ordinary rhythms. Dogs barked, children called, doors closed against the night. Yet beneath the surface, something had changed. Trust, once frayed, would take time to mend. Friendships bruised by suspicion would not recover easily. And though the guild might polish its treasures until they gleamed, the memory of scandal would remain, a faint tarnish never wholly erased. Miss Marple placed her knitting aside and poured herself a small cup of tea. She allowed herself a smile, gentle, almost wistful. People, she murmured, are so very much the same, whether in great cities or tiny villages. One has only to look, and they tell you everything. She sipped her tea, content. For her, the case was closed, not because the plate had been found or the culprit arrested, but because human nature had once again revealed its pattern. It was not triumph she felt, but recognition of the quiet satisfaction of seeing life's truths unfold as she knew they must. And in that moment, the village of St. Mary Mead seemed to settle back into its familiar, deceptive peace, while Miss Marple, ever watchful, waited for the next thread of human folly to cross her path.